Ultimately, I think it comes down to a choice of how you want the adventure to actually go. You can either build the adventure up to its climax, the climax being the reveal that, okay, he's doing something evil, but it's for this purpose. Or you can get that out of the way sooner and then have the adventure basically be the repercussions and conflicts that ensue after the villain has been revealed, and this sort of back and forth between him and the characters. When do you want him to become the party's enemy is really the question. At what point do they turn on each other? And that turning point could work just as easily either way. The adventure could build up to it, or it could happen, and then everything else is a cascade from that point.
Yeah, the next point on here actually sort of is related to your question. This might be a little bit more closer to just general DMing advice, but I think it's important in an adventure to make what you consider to be the interesting parts of the story, the villain's conflict, etc., obvious to the players. Your players they are completely reliant on you for information. So having things hidden can sometimes be interesting because it leads to a reveal, but you have to make sure that you're actively building towards that reveal. It's very easy for players to get thrown off track, to lose sight of what they're trying to find out or trying to do. So it's really up to you as the adventure designer and as the DM to make sure that they see sort of the signposts along the way of here's an interesting, plot element, here's an interesting story element, and sort of keep feeding to the players as the adventure goes on. Do you have a question, sir? That's so. The suggestion was to have the villain actually be the hero's patron in the adventure.
I like it.
It is cool. I do like the idea. It can be it's a little tricky to pull off sometimes because our patron is secretly villainous thing has.
It only works once.
Right, it works once, and let's be honest, we've all already done it, haven't we? No, I actually do like it. One thing I think that makes it more plausible in this scenario is that our villain does have good intentions and is well known as a former adventurer and is well known as a person that has helped the church in the past, etc. So. In a lot of ways, he actually is a good person, and even if he is using the players for evil villainous ends, there's your players should certainly have some conflict there because of the story we've set up so far. So it's definitely one route you could go with this scenario. I think I'm going to talk about something else here in a few minutes that we'll come back to that though. This is just sort of general adventure advice, but make sure the threat is appropriate for the hero's level. It doesn't do you a lot of good if the heroes don't have some way of actually challenging the villain. And I think it's kind of a cheap way out to build your villain to be a lot higher level than your players in order just to keep them alive, unless you're going for like a long-term villain, which Chris has done several times in our campaign. So sometimes we fight bad guys that are 10 levels higher than us until we run away. This really is very simple DMing advice as well. So just make sure that whatever villain you're cooking up that is appropriate to the player's level, or whatever monsters. There's also an element of scale here. Typically, we think of things in the heroic tier as being on sort of a local scale. When you're in the heroic tier, you're going to be facing people that are threatening your town, your village, the area around the village, etc. When you get up to Paragon tier, you're looking at more, I guess, say continental and even maybe world spanning threats. And then when you get into the epic tier, you're talking about threats to the sort of the planes themselves, right? The world, the planes, etc. So when you're designing your adventure, keep in mind that there's sort of an expectation that players and DMs will have as to what kinds of threats they should be facing at that level. It doesn't do you a lot of good to have your third level party facing off against a plane threatening villain, right? It's not. It's going to seem impossible, and it's going to seem artificial if they get to the end of the adventure and this plane-threatening villain is also like a level 4 monster, right? It's going to feel artificial to your players, and it's not going to do you a whole lot of good. We're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but make sure that you're able to react to what the players do and what your antagonist does as well in terms of the story. Basically, when players take actions, it should have some effect on the story, right? The players should feel like they're making some progress and should feel like they've altered the story in some way. And this one, I was actually asked to put this on here by Chris Youngs, using D&D tropes while avoiding cliches. Basically, we all have, we all have things that we know about D&D that are ingrained in our culture as D&D players that have become cliche. And while you can embrace those cliches, it's best to sort of turn them on their head, right? So I'll give you a good example. The doppelganger infiltrates the party cliche, right? We've all probably done that already, and in some cases it may have ruined our campaigns, not speaking from experience at all. But no, the doppelganger infiltrating the party cliche is something that we've all seen or heard done before. But a great way to use that trope without making it cliche is have that be I don't know, for example, the doppelganger infiltrated the party with the best intentions, right? He's actually there to help the party. I replaced your ranger because he's kind of incompetent and I'm better than him, right? Something like that. Right, he was going to turn evil. You just didn't know, right? Look at that guy. He's got a terrible alignment. No, but that it's sort of an unexpected twist on the typical cliche. So when you start thinking about classic themes and classic tropes like that, also think about just turn the knob just a little bit one direction or the other, so that the players get something new and refreshing out of it. And this is another one that Chris Young's asked me to include. Challenging player expectations is good, but if you do it all the time, they can't really have any expectations, right? And I think I'm going to go ahead and bring up the next one here. Yeah, red herrings is another one. Basically, as I was talking about earlier, when you're writing an adventure, the players are 100% dependent upon the DM for their information. So if everything challenges their expectations, they're not really going to know, what to expect at all, right? If you have, these villains are actually secretly good guys, and all these good guys are actually secretly villains, and this happens all the time, you create a world where players don't really have that they can't logically think about what's happening in the setting. You guys want to jump in? You good? Okay, all right. I thought somebody moving over here.
I was just going to say, in a seminar I was in yesterday, story advice, people were saying, well, so you should put red herrings in adventures, right? And we're like, no, the DM is the authority, right? And 95% of the time, the DM, what you hear from the DM's lips, you want to believe is true. And there's only, I think Chris could actually probably pull it off, but in many cases, you don't. There's only a limited amount of time you're going to be playing the game, and when you send your characters down red herrings and you spent 4 hours or 8 hours or whatever, there's kind of there can be a sense of betrayal when you introduce those kind of things as well, and that's not fun.
Certainly when you're running an ongoing campaign and you know it's going to be 5,000 hours long, there's plenty of room to explore all kinds of shades of characters. One of the things I do in my campaign a lot and in my adventures is I try to put information in the mouths of NPCs who may not be right. Their facts might be wrong, and then the characters can go back and when they track back where that information came from, they track it back to specific individuals, and then they discover, oh, that person is full of shit. Everything that they've told us is crap. They are completely misinformed. They're completely incompetent as informants, and suddenly those characters become they're suddenly illuminated as being these incompetent boobs, and the characters recognize that, and so they stop trusting that source, or they start believing the opposite of whatever that character tells them, and that can be very, very fun. So I always try to put information in the mouths of NPCs, and then let the characters of those NPCs come out in such a way that the players realize either immediately or soon thereafter that information is right or wrong because of that individual's personality. Yeah, like for instance, in the campaign, I've got this tiefling informant her name is Excellence, and she is this font of information because she's got this incredible life experience and she slept with all of these pirate captains and she gets all this information from the city because she's in touch with all the criminal syndicates. And some of the things that she tells the party are completely outrageous and unbelievable, but she is always right. She is never wrong, and the characters have just come. If it issues from her mouth, they know it is absolutely fact and they can rely on it. There are other characters where not true.
Yeah, so I think in the end, you just have to keep in mind that the information that you're giving, like your players are completely dependent upon you for information. So if you want to have a character with, say, false information, you need to eventually have it set up that is revealed to your players that it came from that character who is a bad information source. Because otherwise what happens is your players will lose trust in you as the DM and stop being able to believe anything you say to them. And we all like having that funny kind of gotcha moment every now and then, but if you do it too often, or you don't give players means of detecting the falsehoods or detecting the wrong trails, then they'll stop being able to believe anything you say, and things start to break down at that point. All right, henchmen and antagonists. You're gonna have to populate your dungeons with something, right? Basically. The antagonists that you create, the monsters and the creatures and the NPCs that you put in your player's path, need to be contributing to the villain's agenda in some way. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a villain to have henchmen that are working against them, or at least intentionally working against them. I mean, we all know that there's the incompetent henchman who foils the villain's plans through tomfoolery and shenanigans, but when you're picking out your henchmen, it's a good idea to think what kind of henchman would contribute to the villain's success in his plan. What kinds of henchmen are appropriate for that villain's plan? For example, we're talking about our ex-adventurer who has been excommunicated from the church villain. It doesn't make a ton of sense necessarily for him to have extremely vile, villainous henchmen, right? I mean, orcs, maybe not the best henchmen to have for this guy, right? And it could be an interesting, if you could, find a way to make it believable, it could be interesting, but I think it's more likely that to accomplish the goal of the unexpected villain that we've talked about so far, it's more likely that he's got humanoid henchmen, or human henchmen even, elves, dwarves, etc., other henchmen that are likely to look like adventurers, right? I mean, if this guy's an ex-adventurer, then it makes sense for him to have, this henchman, he's a dwarven fighter, right? And I know what a dwarf fighter is. He's an adventurer, right? So that's a good example of how to make your henchmen tie in directly both to the plot and the villain itself.
Sorry, there was a question possibly over here.
Oh yes, sorry. Right. The suggestion is basically that our particular villain's henchmen are former followers of that villain. Right. When he was a hero, they were his hirelings, to use a first edition term, maybe. Right. Maybe he is a first edition hero. That's why he's not a hero anymore. But no, he basically, his henchmen are the guys you hired out of the first edition player's handbook, right? Actually, that might be kind of cool if your players were first edition players. Yes, sir.